October 14th, 2018. Just past sunrise on a stretch of exhausted farmland outside Cedar Ridge, Iowa. A woman stood alone in a shallow pit. She had been digging for 3 straight days. Emma Carter didn't look like someone chasing anything valuable. Her boots were caked in dry clay. Her hands were blistered, wrapped in old cloth. And in her back pocket, folded so many times it barely held together, was a map drawn in her father's shaking hand. Around her a small crowd had gathered. They didn't come to help. They came to watch her fail. Harold Whitman stood at the edge of the pit, his polished shoes carefully avoiding the dirt. He was the kind of man who never touched soil unless it was part of a deal. Owner of Whitman Bank, lender to half the county, and more importantly, the man who now held the debt to Emma's land. Next to him stood a young engineer from Des Moines, hired by a development company that had already made offers on 3 neighboring farms. He held a tablet in one hand, scanning data that to him was absolute truth. Harold chuckled loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're digging in the wrong century, Emma," he said. "Maps like that belong in museums, not in fields that haven't grown a decent crop in 10 years. A few people laughed, not cruelly at first, just the kind of laughter that comes when something feels obvious. But it didn't stop there. The engineer stepped forward, tapping his screen. "We've run full subsurface scans of this entire area," he said, not even looking at her. "No water pockets, no mineral value, no structural anomalies. This land is exhausted." He paused, then added almost as an afterthought, "Whatever you think is down there isn't." Emma didn't answer. She just stepped deeper into the pit, drove her shovel into the ground again, and pulled up another slice of dry, stubborn earth. That was when Harold smiled wider. "Oh, I get it now," he said, turning to the small crowd. "She thinks her father left her a treasure map." This time the laughter was louder. Someone in the back muttered, "Old Tom Carter always was a little off." Another voice, "Guess it runs in the family." Emma heard all of it, but she didn't look up. And that silence, more than anything she could have said, only made them more certain they were right. Because to them, this wasn't determination. It was desperation, and there was nothing more pitiful than watching someone dig for hope in dead ground. But what none of them knew, not Harold, not the engineer, not even the people who had known her father for decades, was that Emma Carter wasn't digging blindly. And this story wasn't really about what was buried in the ground. It was about why her father had made sure only she would ever understand where to look. The humiliation didn't end that morning. It grew. By noon, more people had arrived. Word travels fast in small towns, especially when it smells like failure. Pickup trucks lined the edge of the field. Neighbors who hadn't spoken to Emma in years now stood with arms crossed, watching her like she was some kind of cautionary tale. Harold saw his opportunity. He stepped closer to the edge of the pit, raising his voice just enough to carry. "Let's make this simple," he said. "You owe the bank $92,000, Emma. Payments due in 30 days. You don't pay. This land isn't yours anymore." He let that settle into the air. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded document. "But I'm a reasonable man," he continued. "I'll buy it from you. Today. Cash. You walk away with something instead of nothing." He named a number. It was less than a quarter of what the land had once been worth, even now, even in its dry, cracked state. A murmur moved through the crowd. Some people nodded. It was in their eyes a mercy. Emma climbed out of the pit, slowly brushing dirt from her hands. For the first time that day, she looked directly at Harold. Her voice when she spoke was quiet. Steady. Number. Just that. No explanation. No anger. No hesitation. For a moment, Harold blinked as if he hadn't heard correctly. Then he laughed. Not a polite laugh this time. A sharp, dismissive one. "You're turning down the only lifeline you have," he said. "For what?" "A hole in the ground." The engineer shook his head, almost pitying now. "You're chasing something that doesn't exist." Someone else added, "You're going to lose everything." Emma didn't argue. She didn't try to convince them. She simply stepped back into the pit, picked up her shovel, and kept digging. And that was the moment the laughter turned into something else. Not respect, not yet, but something closer to disbelief, because there was something about the way she moved, slow, deliberate, certain, that didn't match the idea of someone who had lost her mind. Still, to them it didn't matter. Facts were facts. The land was dead. The scans were clear. And Emma Carter was just another stubborn farmer refusing to accept reality. But there was something nobody in that field understood. Not about the land, not about the map, and definitely not about the man who had drawn it. Because if you wanted to understand why Emma was standing in that pit, ignoring every voice telling her she was wrong, you had to go back to a smaller version of that same field, back to a time when the soil still held life, and back to a man who almost never raised his voice, but saw things no one else bothered to notice. Thomas Carter had spent his entire life on that land, not just working it, listening to it. He wasn't the kind of farmer who chased trends or bought the newest equipment, while others upgraded tractors every few years. Thomas kept the same old machine running with parts he repaired himself. While neighbors trusted reports and forecasts, Thomas trusted what he could feel under his boots. People called him old-fashioned, some called him stubborn, a few quietly called him strange, because Thomas Carter had a habit of walking his fields at night. Emma remembered those nights clearly. She would follow him sometimes barefoot in the summer, trying to match his steps. He would stop every few yards, kneel down, pick up a handful of soil and rub it between his fingers, like he was reading something written there. "What are you looking for?" she had asked him once when she was maybe 8 years old. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he handed her the soil. "Smell it," he said. She did. "It just smelled like dirt. I don't get it," she admitted. Thomas smiled slightly. "That's because you're listening with your nose," he said, "not with your patience." He pointed out things she would have never noticed. The way the color shifted just slightly between one patch and the next. The way moisture held differently under the surface even when everything looked dry on top. The way certain weeds grew only in specific lines, like they were following something invisible. "Land remembers," he told her once, "even when people forget." At the time, it sounded like one of those sayings adults used when they didn't want to explain something properly. But years later, those words would matter more than anything else he ever said. Thomas hadn't always been just a farmer. That was something most people didn't know. Before Emma was born, he had worked for a small geological survey company. Not a big one. Not the kind that made headlines, but the kind that spent months mapping land no one else cared about. He left that job without much explanation, came back to the farm, and never talked about it again. But sometimes, late at night, Emma would catch him in the shed going through old notebooks, sketching lines, marking measurements, drawing maps that looked nothing like the neat printed charts the engineers used. His maps were messy, hand-drawn, full of small notes in the margins, and always centered around patterns no one else seemed to see. When Emma got older, she asked him once why he never sold the land, especially when the yields started dropping. "Because this land isn't done," he said simply. "But it looks dead," she replied. Thomas shook his head. "Looks can lie," he said, "but structure doesn't." She didn't fully understand what he meant. Not then, maybe not even years later, but she remembered the way he said it, like it wasn't a belief, it was a certainty. And then, 10 years before that morning in October, Thomas Carter died, quietly, no long illness. No wedding. Just a heart that stopped after a lifetime of steady work. After the funeral, after the neighbors left, and the casseroles stopped coming, Emma found the map. It wasn't hidden, just folded inside one of his old notebooks. A single sheet of paper yellowed at the edges. On it, a rough outline of their land. And in the center, a small deliberate X. There were no instructions, no explanation. Just one line written at the bottom in his uneven handwriting. 6 feet. Not deeper, unless you understand why. Emma stared at that sentence for a long time. It didn't make sense, not fully, but something about it stayed with her. She kept the map, through the years when the crops failed, through the seasons when the soil turned harder, less forgiving, through the visits from people like Harold, offering to take the land off her hands. She kept it, even when she had no reason to believe it meant anything. Because deep down, she knew her father didn't leave things behind by accident. And now, standing in that pit with the entire town watching her like she was chasing a ghost, Emma Carter wasn't digging for treasure. She was following a lesson that had taken her an entire lifetime to begin to understand. And the truth was, she hadn't even reached the part that would change everything yet. The fourth day came with colder wind. By then, the hole was no longer something people could laugh off as a passing, stubborn act. It was real. Deep enough that Emma's shoulders disappeared when she stood at the bottom. The edges were packed firm, cut clean, not by machinery, but by repetition. Careful, consistent effort. And still, she hadn't stopped. But the land around her had. Not physically, socially. People who once waved from their trucks now drove past without slowing down. Conversations in town shifted when her name came up. Some said she was grieving in the wrong way. Others said she had always been a little too quiet, a little too different. And Harold Whitman, he saw something else. Opportunity. By the end of that week, a letter arrived at Emma's mailbox. Official. Final. Printed on thick paper that didn't bend easily. Notice of default. 30 days. That was all she had left. What most people didn't understand was that Harold wasn't just trying to collect a debt. He was clearing the board. The development company behind him had already secured land on 3 sides of Emma's property. Solar fields, they said. Clean energy. Progress. But what they really needed was continuity. Her land sat right in the middle. Without it, their plage. With it, they controlled everything. And Emma knew that. She had known it the moment Harold started showing up more often than usual. But still, she kept digging. Not faster, not harder, just steadily. And that was the part that began to unsettle people. Because desperation looks frantic. It looks messy. Emma didn't look desperate. She looked certain. And certainty, when it refuses to explain itself, makes people uncomfortable. By day 8, the engineer came back. Not alone this time. He brought equipment. A small team. Ground scanners. Sensors that beeped and hummed as they moved across the field. They mapped the area around Emma's pit running lines in perfect grids, feeding data into sleek screens. Emma watched them from below, leaning on her shovel. They worked for hours. At one point, the engineer crouched near the edge, glancing down at her. "You're wasting your time," he said. "Get quieter now. Less performance. More insistence." Emma tilted her head slightly. "Then why are you still here?" she asked. He didn't answer, just stood up and went back to his machines. Because the truth was, something about her refusal to stop had begun to bother him. Not logically. The data still said the same thing. Nothing below. No anomalies. No reason to keep digging. And yet, he couldn't quite explain why he had come back, or why he kept checking the readings twice, or why every time Emma drove her shovel into the ground. He found himself watching more closely than he intended, because there was something about the way she moved that didn't match someone chasing a mistake. It matched someone following a pattern, but that didn't make sense. And that's what made it dangerous. By day 12, the pit had reached nearly 5 feet. The soil had changed, not dramatically, not in a way the machines picked up, but enough that Emma noticed. The color shifted slightly darker. The texture held together differently. When she pressed it between her fingers, it didn't crumble the same way the upper layers had. She paused, just for a moment, closed her eyes, and somewhere buried in memory, her father's voice surfaced again. "Don't just look at the soil. Feel what it's trying to hold." Emma knelt down, ran her hand slowly along the wall of the pit. There, a line, subtle, barely visible, but consistent, running across the side like a boundary that had nothing to do with what people could see from above. She exhaled slowly, because that line tortue wasn't supposed to be there. Not in land that had been dead for a decade. Not in soil that engineers had already declared empty. And suddenly, this wasn't just about a map anymore. This was about something being hidden in plain structure. Something that hadn't been erased. Just ignored. Up above, Harold returned again that afternoon. This time he didn't laugh right away. He just stood there looking down into the pit, studying, calculating. "You're getting deeper," he said finally. Emma didn't respond. He nodded toward the soil around her. You notice anything different? He asked. Still no answer. But Emma's silence wasn't empty. It was guarded, and Harold saw that, which meant something had changed. His tone shifted, softer now, almost persuasive. Look, he said, I can extend your deadline, give you more time, but you need to be realistic. There's nothing down there that's going to save you. Emma looked up at him then, not with anger, not with defiance, just a calm that didn't belong in someone about to lose everything. I'm not digging to be saved, she said. Harold frowned. Then what are you doing? Emma held his gaze for a second longer than most people would have been comfortable with, finishing something she said, and then she went back to work. That answer followed him longer than he expected, because it didn't sound like hope. It sounded like completion. And that was a problem, because people chasing hope can be negotiated with. People finishing something, they don't stop. By day 18, the entire town was watching, not always in person, but in conversation. At the diner, at the gas station, at church, the story had shifted. It was no longer just about a woman digging a hole. It was about how far she would go, and whether at the end of it, there would be anything at all. The engineer came back again. This time he didn't bring the whole team, just himself, and one scanner. He walked slowly around the pit, taking readings again, pausing, rechecking. Emma could feel his attention now, focused, unsettled. He crouched near the edge. There's a density shift, he said, almost to himself. Emma didn't look up. Machines can't explain it. He continued. Then maybe they're not supposed to, she replied quietly. He glanced down at her. For the first time since this began, he didn't look confident. He looked some uncertain now, and that uncertainty spread faster than any rumor, because when the man with the data starts questioning his own readings, people notice. But even then, no one was prepared for what Emma was about to realize, because the map her father left behind was never meant to lead her to something deep. It was meant to stop her at exactly the right place, and understanding that difference was the part that would change everything. By the 25th day, the wind had changed. Colder, sharper, the kind that cuts across open land and carries every sound farther than it should. And that morning, there were more people than ever. They lined the edges of the field, standing in clusters, hands buried in coat pockets, boots shifting against dry soil. Some had come out of curiosity. Others came because they felt something building, something they didn't understand, but didn't want to miss. Harold Whitman stood closer than usual. No smile this time, no jokes, just a quiet tension in the way he watched, because this wasn't amusing anymore. This was nearing the end, and if Emma Carter failed now, it would be public, final, undeniable. The engineer was there too, but he wasn't holding his tablet. He wasn't scanning. He was just watching, like a man who had run out of explanations and was waiting to see which one would break first. Emma stood at the bottom of the pit, 6 feet deep. Exactly. No more, no less. Her shovel rested against the wall beside her. Her hands, wrapped in worn cloth, hovered just above the soil. She didn't move right away, and that stillness spread. The crowd quieted. Even the wind seemed to pull back for a moment. Harold finally broke the silence. Well, he called down. This is it, isn't it? 6 feet. A few scattered chuckles. Nervous this time. Looks like your father's map led you to dirt, someone muttered. Emma didn't look up, because she wasn't listening to them anymore. She was listening to something else. Her fingers pressed slowly into the soil wall, feeling, not digging, tracing. And then she stopped. There, a difference, not in depth, in resistance. She shifted closer, brushing away loose earth with the side of her hand. The texture changed beneath her touch, subtle but undeniable. Not rock, not wood, something shaped. Her breath slowed, and for the first time since this began, she didn't reach for the shovel. She used her hands, carefully, deliberately, each movement slower than the last. Up above, someone leaned forward. "What is she doing?" a voice whispered. No one answered, because whatever this was, it didn't look like digging anymore. It looked like uncovering. Emma cleared away another thin layer, and then her fingers struck something solid, a dull hollow sound, not loud, but sharp enough to cut through the air. The engineer stiffened. Harold's eyes narrowed. Emma froze for just a second, then continued. The shape revealed itself. Gradually, edges, corners, flat surfaces where none should exist. And then, the outline became clear. A box, metal, old, buried exactly 6 feet beneath the surface. A murmur moved through the crowd, confused, uneasy. Because this wasn't supposed to be here, Harold laughed. Too quickly, too loudly. A box, he said. That's what this is about. All this for a rusted piece of junk. Some people joined in, relieved laughter, because if it was just a box, then everything still made sense. Emma didn't respond. She cleared the rest of it free, lifted it slowly. It was heavier than it looked, set it gently on the ground beside her. For a moment, she just stared at it, not with excitement, not with triumph, but with recognition, like she had seen it before, or at least, always known it would be there. Up above, Harold crossed his arms. Go ahead, he said. Open it. Let's see what your father left you. There was a sharpness in his voice now, not confidence, pressure, because something about this had already gone further than he expected. Emma wiped her hands, reached for the lid. It resisted at first. Rust sealed along the edges, but not completely. With a slow, steady pull, it gave. The sound it made. Quiet, final, and when she opened it, the field fell silent. Inside, there was no gold, no money, no treasure, just papers, carefully wrapped, preserved, and beneath them, small sealed containers, samples. The engineer moved before he realized he was moving. He dropped to his knees at the edge of the pit. What is that? He asked, voice lower now. Emma didn't answer. She handed one of the samples up. He caught it, turned it in his hands, examined it, and then everything in his face changed. Not confusion, not curiosity, recognition, sharp, immediate, unavoidable. He looked back down at her. Where did you get this? He asked. Emma held his gaze. My father buried it, she said. The engineer shook his head slightly, already opening the container, already checking what he didn't want to believe. Harold stepped forward. What is it? Eyes demanded. The engineer didn't answer her right away, because he was no longer looking at the sample. He was looking at the ground, the field, the entire stretch of land that had been dismissed as worthless. And when he finally spoke, his voice didn't sound the same. This isn't empty land, he said. A pause, long enough for the words to settle. Then, it's a deposit. The crowd didn't react immediately, because they didn't understand. But Harold did, and the color drained from his face. What kind of deposit? He asked. The engineer swallowed. Rare earth, he said. High concentration, stable layer, right under the 6-foot line. Silence, heavy, total, because suddenly, everything shifted. All the scans, all the data, all the certainty. Wrong. Not completely. Just pointed in the wrong direction. They had searched deeper, looking for volume, for scale, for something obvious. But they had missed the one thing that mattered. The layer, the exact depth, the place where structure held value. And Thomas Carter had known it. Years ago, before the machines, before the reports, he had found it, documented it, and then buried the proof at the only depth where it would remain untouched, unnoticed, until someone understood why it was there. Emma didn't smile, didn't celebrate. She simply climbed out of the pit, stood on level ground again, holding the map that had never been wrong. Harold stepped back. For the first time since anyone could remember, he had nothing to say, because everything he had built his certainty on had just collapsed in front of him. And Emma Carter, the quiet woman they had laughed at for nearly a month, had just turned a hole in dead land into the most valuable ground in the county. What happened next was the part nobody in Cedar Ridge ever forgot. Within days, the trucks came, not from small local companies, from corporations, specialists, people who didn't laugh when they saw dirt, but calculated when they saw potential. Tests confirmed what the engineer had already realized. The deposit was real, significant, and perfectly positioned. Offers followed, big ones, numbers that didn't get spoken out loud in public places. Emma paid off the bank before the deadline even arrived. In full. No negotiation, no delay. Harold Whitman received the payment in his office, hands stiff as he signed the release papers. The same man who had stood at the edge of her pit, offering to take everything for a fraction of its worth, now had no claim to anything at all. And that wasn't the worst part for him. The investigation came later. Questions about pressure tactics, about timing, about how aggressively he had tried to acquire land that, as it turned out, he didn't fully understand. His name, once spoken with respect, started carrying a different tone, quieter, colder. The engineer returned too, but this time, he didn't bring machines. He stood in front of Emma, hat in hand. "I was wrong," he said. Simple, direct. She nodded once. "That happens," she replied. No bitterness, no need to prove anything, because the land had already done that for her. The town changed. Of course it did. People who had laughed now told the story differently, like they had always believed, like they had seen it coming. But Emma didn't correct them. She didn't remind them of what they had said, because that wasn't the point. She kept working the land. Not all of it. She leased part of it for extraction, kept the rest. The same way her father had, walking it, listening, paying attention to things most people ignored. And sometimes in the evenings she would stand near the edge of that old pit, now filled back in, and unfold the map one more time, not because she needed it anymore, but because it reminded her of something most people never learn, that what lies beneath the surface isn't always hidden. Sometimes it's simply waiting for someone patient enough to understand where to stop, because this story was never really about a buried box, or rare minerals, or money. It was about a woman who refused to let louder voices rewrite what she knew to be true. It was about a man who trusted his understanding of the land more than any machine ever built. And it was about a lesson that Cedar Ridge would carry long after the field had changed hands. Don't laugh at what you don't understand. Don't measure value by what looks obvious. And never assume that quiet people are empty, because sometimes they're the only ones who've been listening all along.